The house on Maple Street looked peaceful from the outside, with its neat lawn and warm yellow lights glowing through the windows, but inside, Emily Carter often felt like she was living in a quiet storm no one else could see. She had moved to the suburbs outside Seattle 6 years earlier after marrying Daniel Thompson, believing love would fill every corner of their new life, yet somewhere between promotions, deadlines, and endless work calls, that warmth had slowly faded into silence. Daniel had always been driven, and at first Emily admired his ambition, proudly listening as he spoke about projects and future plans, but over time those plans began to leave her out. He came home later each night, his tie loose, his eyes tired, his phone still buzzing in his hand, offering quick kisses and shorter conversations before disappearing into his home office. Emily tried to ignore the growing distance, telling herself this was normal, that real marriages were not like movies, yet the emptiness followed her from room to room, sitting beside her during dinner when Daniel canceled again, whispering to her when she folded laundry alone, pressing against her chest when she lay awake staring at the ceiling while he slept beside her without reaching for her hand. She missed the small things most, the way he once laughed at her silly jokes, the way he used to surprise her with late-night ice cream runs, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room, and now she felt more like a background detail in his busy life. Emily worked at a marketing firm downtown, and her days were full of meetings and emails, yet even in crowded conference rooms she felt alone, because loneliness is not about being by yourself, it is about feeling unseen, and that feeling grew stronger each week. She tried to talk to Daniel more than once, choosing calm evenings when he seemed relaxed, explaining that she missed him, that she needed more time together, but he would smile gently and say, "It's just a busy season, promising things would slow down soon," and she wanted to believe him so badly that she swallowed her disappointment and nodded, though deep inside she knew the busy season had lasted almost 2 years. Their anniversary passed quietly, marked by a rushed dinner reservation Daniel almost forgot, and when she returned home that night she stood in the kitchen staring at the sink, realizing she felt more like a roommate than a wife. Weeks later, during a neighborhood barbecue, she watched other couples laugh easily and felt a strange ache in her chest, wondering when she and Daniel had stopped looking at each other that way. She began filling her time with small distractions, morning jogs, longer showers, extra hours at work, anything to avoid sitting alone with her thoughts, yet the silence always returned at night, heavy and loud. One Friday evening Daniel called to say he would not be home until midnight because of a client emergency, and Emily stood by the window watching rain fall over the dark street, fighting tears she could not fully explain. She was not angry, not exactly, just tired of feeling forgotten. That same night, her phone rang, and the name on the screen surprised her, Margaret Thompson, Daniel's mother, calling from Portland. Margaret had always been polite and kind, though not overly involved, the type of woman who sent thoughtful birthday cards and warm holiday messages but respected boundaries, so Emily answered with a bright voice, hiding the sadness she carried. Margaret spoke gently, asking about life, about work, about Daniel, and something in her tone felt different, almost as if she could sense what was unspoken. After a short pause she said she had been thinking about visiting for a few days, explaining she missed them both and wanted a change of scenery, and without fully thinking it through, Emily agreed, feeling a sudden flicker of relief at the idea of company in the quiet house. When she told Daniel later, he sounded distracted but supportive, saying it would be nice to see his mother, though he warned that work would still keep him busy. The days before Margaret arrived moved quickly, yet Emily's loneliness did not fade. If anything, she became more aware of it, noticing the untouched wine glasses in the cabinet, the candle she had bought months ago and never lit, the empty space on the couch beside her each evening. She remembered how excited she had been when they first bought the house, imagining family dinners and shared mornings, and now she wondered when hope had slowly turned into habit. The morning Margaret arrived, the sky was clear and bright, and Emily forced a cheerful smile as she opened the door, hugging her mother-in-law warmly, breathing in the scent of familiar perfume and something comforting she could not name. Margaret looked at her closely, her kind eyes studying Emily's face for a moment longer than usual, as if reading lines written between smiles, but she said nothing at first, simply stepping inside and complimenting the home. Daniel left early for work that day, apologizing quickly and promising to return for dinner, and once the door closed behind him, the house felt strangely honest, no longer pretending to be full. Emily and Margaret spent the afternoon talking about simple things, recipes, weather, neighbors, yet beneath the light conversation was an unspoken understanding that something deeper waited to be acknowledged. That evening Daniel texted to say he would be late again, and Emily felt the now familiar drop in her stomach, but this time she was not alone when it happened. Margaret saw the way her shoulders lowered, the way her smile faded just slightly, and she reached across the kitchen table, placing her hand gently over Emily's. "You look lonely," Margaret said softly, not accusing, not dramatic, just truthful. The words hit harder than any argument could have, because they named the feeling Emily had tried to hide even from herself, and before she could stop them, tears slipped down her cheeks, surprising her with their speed and force. She quickly apologized, embarrassed by her own emotion, but Margaret squeezed her hand and shook her head, telling her there was nothing to be sorry for. In that quiet kitchen, with rain beginning to tap lightly against the windows again, Emily felt something shift inside her, as if the walls she had built around her heart were finally cracking, and for the first time in many months she allowed herself to admit the truth. She was married, she was busy, she was surrounded by people, and yet she felt completely alone, and she did not know how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. Margaret did not react with shock when Emily's tears fell. Instead she held her hand firmly and waited, giving her the kind of silence that feels safe rather than empty, and that quiet patience allowed Emily to speak more openly than she had in years. Words rushed out of her in a steady stream as she explained how Daniel's long hours had slowly built a wall between them, how she felt like a polite guest in her own marriage, how she missed being seen and heard, and Margaret listened without interrupting, her eyes calm and thoughtful. When Emily finally stopped, embarrassed by how much she had shared, Margaret surprised her by saying softly, "Loneliness can make good people feel lost," and there was a weight in her voice that hinted at experience rather than judgment. Emily looked up, confused, and Margaret took a slow breath before confessing something she had never spoken about so openly before. Years ago, during a difficult period in her own marriage, she had felt deeply alone too, especially when her husband traveled often and left her managing the house and raising Daniel by herself. And during that season she had grown emotionally close to a man at her workplace who simply listened to her stories and noticed her effort. She explained that nothing inappropriate had happened, no lines had been crossed, but the emotional connection had shaken her because it reminded her how starved she had been for attention, and she admitted she had almost mistaken that comfort for love before stepping back and choosing to face her marriage honestly instead of escaping into temporary relief. Emily felt her heart race as she listened, because Margaret's story felt uncomfortably close to her own reality. At the marketing firm where she worked, there was a colleague named Ryan who had become a bright spot in her otherwise gray routine, a kind and easygoing man who asked about her day and remembered small details she mentioned, someone who noticed when she seemed tired and offered encouraging words without being asked. Their conversations had started harmlessly, about projects and deadlines, but lately they had drifted into deeper talks about life and dreams, and Emily had caught herself smiling at his messages more than she wanted to admit, not because she planned anything wrong, but because she felt valued in those moments, and that realization filled her with guilt and confusion. Margaret seemed to sense the unspoken truth and said gently, "Sometimes attention feels like love when we haven't felt seen in a long time," and those words struck Emily with sharp clarity. She confessed that she had started looking forward to talking with someone outside her marriage, that it scared her how easy it felt, and that she did not want to become someone who betrayed her vows even emotionally. Margaret did not scold her, instead she squeezed her hand and said, the fact that you are worried means your heart is still in the right place. She explained that emotional distance can quietly push people toward dangerous edges, not because they are bad, but because they are human, and she reminded Emily that the real issue was not the new attention but the silence inside her marriage. Margaret urged her not to ignore her feelings or bury them out of fear of conflict, telling her that unspoken pain grows stronger in the dark, and she shared how, years ago, the turning point in her own marriage had come when she chose honesty over comfort, sitting down with her husband and explaining exactly how lonely she felt instead of pretending everything was fine. Emily listened closely, realizing she had been waiting for Daniel to notice her sadness without clearly showing it, hoping he would magically understand what she needed, and Margaret gently challenged that hope by asking, "Have you truly told him how serious this feels?" The question lingered in the air, forcing Emily to admit that she had spoken softly about missing him but had never expressed how deeply the loneliness was affecting her, never explained that she felt herself drifting emotionally and feared what that distance might lead to. Margaret's expression remained calm but firm as she said, "Before you search for comfort somewhere else, make sure you have fought for your marriage with honesty," and that advice settled heavily in Emily's chest. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the windows clear, and in that stillness Emily felt a shift inside her, a realization that she stood at a crossroads. One path offered easy validation and temporary warmth, while the other required courage, vulnerability, and the risk of rejection. She understood that talking to Daniel openly might lead to an argument or disappointment, but avoiding the conversation would only deepen the quiet gap between them. Margaret stood and began clearing the dishes, giving Emily space to think, and as she moved around the kitchen she added one final thought: marriage is not just about staying faithful in action, it is about protecting the emotional bond too. Those words echoed in Emily's mind long after the dishes were washed and the lights were dimmed. That night she lay awake beside Daniel, who had come home late again and fallen asleep quickly, and she studied his face in the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, remembering the young man who once stayed up talking with her about everything and nothing, remembering how safe she used to feel in his arms. She realized she still loved him deeply, but love alone could not survive without effort, and she understood that her loneliness was not a signal to run away but a warning that something inside their marriage needed attention. By morning she felt a new determination rising in her chest, not anger, not resentment, but clarity. She would speak honestly, even if her voice shook, even if the truth felt uncomfortable, because pretending had already cost her too much peace. As she watched Daniel tie his tie and prepare for another long day, she almost lost her nerve, but Margaret's steady advice replayed in her thoughts, reminding her that silence was more dangerous than confrontation. When Daniel kissed her goodbye and reached for the door, Emily gently asked him to come home early that evening because she needed to talk, and the seriousness in her tone made him pause and nod. After he left, she stood in the quiet hallway, heart pounding but steady, knowing that the conversation ahead could either bring them closer or reveal cracks she had been afraid to face, yet for the first time in months she did not feel helpless, she felt brave, because she had chosen honesty over escape, and whatever happened next, she knew she would no longer hide from the truth. Daniel came home earlier than usual that evening, his steps slower, his expression serious, as if he sensed the waiting inside the house, and Emily felt her heart pound when she heard the door close because she knew this conversation could change everything. Margaret quietly retreated to the guest room after greeting her son, giving them privacy without asking questions, and the living room felt tense but calm as Emily asked Daniel to sit down across from her on the couch where they once shared long talks and easy laughter. For a moment neither spoke, the silence thick but honest, and then Emily took a steady breath and began, her voice soft yet firm as she told him she could not continue pretending that everything was fine, that she felt deeply alone in their marriage and afraid of what that loneliness was doing to her heart. Daniel looked surprised at first, almost defensive, starting to mention work pressure and responsibilities, but Emily gently stopped him and asked him to truly listen, not to fix, not to argue, just to hear her, and something in her tone made him lean back and focus fully for the first time in a long while. She explained how the long dinners by herself made her feel forgotten, how sleeping beside him without connection felt colder than sleeping alone, how she missed the version of them that laughed without checking the clock, and as she spoke her voice trembled yet she did not hold back, because she had promised herself honesty. Daniel's expression slowly shifted from confusion to realization, and she could see the moment when her words finally reached him, when he understood that this was not about a bad week or a small disagreement but about a growing distance that had been building for years. Then Emily said the hardest part, admitting that she had started enjoying attention from someone at work, that the conversations were innocent but meaningful, and that it frightened her how easy it felt to talk to someone else when she struggled to connect with her own husband. The room went completely still, and Daniel's face lost color, not from anger but from shock, and he asked quietly if she had crossed any lines, and she answered quickly that she had not and did not want to, that she was telling him now because she wanted to protect their marriage before real damage happened. That confession hit him harder than any accusation could have, because it forced him to see how close he had come to losing her without even noticing the warning signs. Daniel ran his hands through his hair and admitted that he had been so focused on providing stability and success that he believed he was showing love through hard work, never realizing that his absence was creating pain instead of security, and for the first time he acknowledged that he had ignored her earlier attempts to talk, brushing them aside with promises that never turned into change. Emily listened carefully, not wanting excuses but clarity, and she told him she needed more than apologies, she needed effort, time, and presence, because she did not want to slowly drift into a life filled with quiet resentment. The honesty between them felt uncomfortable but freeing, like opening windows in a room that had been closed too long, and Daniel admitted he was scared of failing at work, scared of not being enough, and had thrown himself into his job to avoid feeling that fear, not realizing he was creating a different failure at home. Emily felt a mix of sadness and relief hearing this truth, understanding that his distance had not been about lack of love but about misplaced priorities, yet she made it clear that love required action, not just intention. Daniel moved closer and took her hands, promising to adjust his schedule, to set boundaries at work, to attend counseling if needed, and to rebuild what had weakened, and this time his voice carried seriousness rather than quick reassurance. Margaret watched quietly from the hallway for a moment before stepping away again, trusting them to handle their own turning point, and inside the living room the air felt different, heavy but hopeful. Emily told Daniel she was willing to fight for their marriage but would not continue in silence, and Daniel nodded, saying he did not want to lose the life they had built together, that he had taken her strength for granted and forgotten that she needed care too. They talked for hours, not shouting, not blaming, but uncovering layers of misunderstanding that had grown unnoticed, discussing how small habits like phones at dinner and cancelled plans had slowly eroded connection, and by the time the clock showed midnight they were emotionally exhausted yet strangely closer than they had been in a long time. Daniel asked for a chance to prove his commitment through action, not promises, and Emily agreed, though she knew rebuilding trust would take consistency and patience, not one good conversation. Before going to bed, Daniel thanked her for being honest instead of hiding her feelings, and she admitted she had almost stayed silent out of fear, but Margaret's advice had given her courage to speak before regret could take root. That night when they lay in bed, Daniel reached for her hand in the dark, something he had not done in months, and though the gesture was simple it felt meaningful, a small sign that awareness had returned. Emily knew challenges would remain and habits would not change overnight, but she also sensed that something important had shifted, because they had finally faced the truth instead of avoiding it. Down the hall, Margaret smiled quietly, knowing that real change begins not with perfection but with honesty, and as the house settled into sleep, Emily felt cautious hope replace the heavy loneliness that once filled her chest, understanding that the breaking point had not destroyed her marriage but forced it into the light where healing could begin. Change did not arrive in one dramatic moment, it came quietly, step by step, in small choices made every day after that long conversation, and Emily watched carefully to see if Daniel's promises would turn into action or fade like before. The first sign was simple but powerful. He came home early the very next evening, placing his phone on the kitchen counter and leaving it there while they ate dinner together, asking about her day and listening without rushing her words, and though the meal was ordinary, it felt different because his attention was steady and real. Over the next weeks he began setting clearer boundaries at work, declining unnecessary late meetings and protecting weekends as time for them, and while deadlines still existed, he no longer treated them as an excuse to disappear emotionally. Emily noticed the effort and responded with openness of her own, sharing her thoughts more freely instead of hiding disappointment behind polite smiles, and slowly their conversations grew deeper, not just about schedules but about fears, goals, and the quiet expectations they had never voiced before. They agreed to attend counseling, and in those sessions they uncovered patterns neither had understood, Daniel admitting he equated success with constant work because he feared failure, Emily admitting she often withdrew instead of demanding change because she feared conflict, and recognizing these habits allowed them to approach each other with more patience rather than blame. Margaret returned to Portland but continued calling every few days, not to interfere but to encourage growth, reminding them that rebuilding trust requires consistency and kindness, and Emily felt grateful for the calm wisdom that had guided her through the hardest moment. At work she gently created distance from Ryan, keeping conversations professional and brief, understanding that protecting her marriage meant setting clear emotional boundaries, and though it felt awkward at first, she sensed relief in choosing clarity over confusion. Daniel, aware of her honesty about that near mistake, did not hold it over her but instead used it as motivation to stay present, recognizing how close they had come to drifting apart without ever intending harm. Months passed, and their home began to feel warm again, filled with small signs of connection like shared morning coffee, evening walks through the neighborhood, and spontaneous laughter over inside jokes that slowly returned. They planned a short weekend trip to the Oregon coast, something they had not done in years, and as they stood watching the waves crash against the rocks, Emily felt a peaceful certainty that this effort was real, not temporary, because Daniel was no longer distracted by constant notifications but focused on the moment they were sharing. There were still difficult days, moments when work pressure resurfaced or old frustrations tried to creep back in. Yet instead of retreating into silence they addressed issues quickly, remembering how close they had come to losing each other when words were left unsaid. One evening, as they sat on the backyard porch watching the sunset paint the sky in soft orange light, Daniel turned to her and said he was grateful she had spoken up before resentment turned into regret, admitting that her courage had saved their marriage from quiet collapse. Emily smiled, knowing that strength had grown from vulnerability, and she told him she had almost chosen the easier path of emotional escape but was thankful she had paused long enough to fight for what truly mattered. She realized that loneliness had not been an enemy but a warning sign, a signal that something precious needed attention, and facing that signal had changed her life forever. Margaret visited again that spring, and this time the house felt different, alive with warmth and steady conversation, and she noticed the way Daniel and Emily looked at each other, not perfectly but intentionally, choosing connection even in small gestures. Over dinner Daniel thanked his mother for encouraging honesty rather than judgment, and Margaret simply smiled, reminding them that love is not about never facing temptation or distance but about recognizing it early and choosing each other again and again. As the seasons shifted and routines settled into healthier rhythms, Emily found herself no longer counting empty hours or fearing quiet evenings, because quiet no longer meant isolation, it meant peace. She understood that infidelity does not always begin with action but with emotional absence, and by confronting that absence directly she had protected her marriage before permanent damage occurred. Looking back, She saw how close she had come to losing herself in silent disappointment, yet she also saw how that painful season forced growth, maturity, and deeper understanding between them. Daniel continued to balance ambition with presence, not perfectly but consistently, and Emily supported his goals while clearly expressing her needs, creating a partnership built on communication rather than assumption. Their story was not dramatic or flawless, but it was honest, and that honesty became the foundation of a stronger future. On their 7th anniversary they returned to the same restaurant where they once felt distant, and this time conversation flowed easily, laughter filling the space that once felt strained, and as Daniel reached across the table to hold her hand, Emily felt a quiet gratitude for the difficult path they had walked together. She knew challenges would always exist, but she also knew they now had the tools to face them side by side instead of turning away. Loneliness had once threatened to divide them, yet through courage, guidance, and steady effort it had transformed into a turning point that reshaped their marriage, and as they drove home under a clear night sky, Emily realized her life had changed forever, not because she escaped her pain, but because she confronted it with honesty and chose love with intention.